All right, good morning, everybody. Today's lesson will be very, very short. Just want to cover the next couple concepts in this chapter that kind of stem from central place theory that we talked about yesterday, those being rank-sized rule and the gravity model. So what we kind of finished up on yesterday is we introduced this idea of central place theory, and we looked at these concepts. So the hinterland, the area from which consumers are drawn for a given service, the range, which is the maximum distance that people are willing to travel to get to that thing, and then the threshold, which is the number of people that are needed to support whatever that given service happens to be. Now, just to kind of follow up on that a little bit and give you an example of this, generally only consumer services that have really small thresholds, small ranges, and small market areas are found in small settlements. So that's kind of the example I gave yesterday with Phillipsburg. Is if you look at the types of businesses you would see in Phillipsburg, you're going to see gas stations, maybe a really small restaurant, small stores that don't take a lot of people to support them. People aren't willing to drive really far to get there. And those are the types of businesses that will survive there. The types of businesses that you wouldn't see in a city like Phillipsburg would be something like Kings Island, obviously, the Cheesecake Factory, anything like that that takes a lot more people to sustain. Those are going to be found in bigger cities with larger populations that can draw from a much bigger area. So larger settlements tend to provide consumer services that have larger thresholds, larger ranges, and larger market areas. That's the example we gave with yesterday's writing prompt as it pertains to the Schuster Center. You see that a lot with different types of businesses. And then generally what we see in developed countries is that developed countries have a lot of little tiny cities that have small settlements, small thresholds and small ranges, and far fewer large settlements with large thresholds and large ranges. So if you look at the United States, we have a ton of really small cities in the United States. We only have a handful of really, really big cities. We have a lot of kind of medium-sized cities like Dayton, and then we have our tons of suburbs like you would see with Englewood, and then tons of small cities that we would see in a lot of our rural areas. So in our big cities, we see, or in our developed countries, we see that a lot. Now, this is a perfect example of central place theory, and they picked out the city of Minot, North Dakota, which you've probably never heard of before. But you've got the city of Minot, and you see that there in the middle, and it's your city. And then around that, you almost see that circle of the lighter purple cities of the small towns. So we have Kenmare, Stanley, Newtown, Garrison, Harvey, Rugby, and Bottineau, which are our small towns that kind of circle the major city. And you can see that all of those cities are pretty much on some sort of major state route or highway that connects them to the main road that draws them to the city. Then we have all of our little tiny villages that are surrounding, that are kind of everywhere. And then we have our really, really tiny towns, which are our hamlets, which are things like Phillipsburg that you would see in various places like that. So cities like Granville and Sawyer and Des Lacs, which are there around Minot, those would be cities like Englewood and Union, which are a lot smaller. And then you have your little tiny hamlets. And you can kind of take this map and apply this through a lot of different places in the United States. You tend to see these same patterns in a lot of different places. But this is a really perfect example of one where you really have that central city kind of looped by all of these smaller towns where you see different things with thresholds. So Minot would be the big city here. It would be the big draw. Obviously, it's not a super big city, so you're not going to see baseball teams or anything like that there. But it would be your major city where you would see your hospitals and your performing arts venues and things like that. So that would be kind of an example of central place theory by looking at a map. Now, a couple things that we see, and there's a couple concepts here that I want to kind of compare the difference between developed and developing countries. Developing countries tend to have what we call primate city. And a primate city is one really, really big city whose population is more than double that of the next biggest city. So when I had you do the map quizzes from all those countries all around the world, so if you look at South America and Europe and Africa, particularly our developing countries, so Africa, some of our Asian countries, some of our Central or South American countries, they tend to have one big city And that tends to be the city where international business would take place. So if I'm going to do business in Ethiopia, chances are it's going to be in Addis Ababa, because that's their one big city. And that's going to be where the development is within that country. So a lot of big cities, or I'm sorry, a lot of developing countries have that one big city. So we call that a primate city, which is where most of the development takes place in that country. And it's a city that has more than double the population of its next biggest settlement. Now, most developed countries utilize what we call rank-sized rule. And again, this does not fit perfectly, because this is kind of the idea of a model, but you can kind of see some patterns here. Now, the idea of rank-sized rule is that a country's nth biggest city, so second biggest city, third biggest city, and so on, has 1 over n the population of the largest city. So the example there would be the second largest city in a country would have half the population of the first. The third largest city would have a third the population of the first. The fourth largest would have a fourth the population, and so on. So rank size settlements is generally what we use to kind of look at our developed countries and kind of see where the major big cities are. So if you look at the United States, the largest city by population in the US is New York City. And if you look at, for instance, the fifth largest city in the United States, which is Houston, it has roughly a fifth the population of New York. So it's not exact. And again, you're never going to see this to be exactly correct. But the best country that really shows this as an example is if you look up the population of the cities in Mexico. And Mexico City is essentially a primate city because it has more than double the population of the next biggest city. But from there on out, like the third biggest city, the fourth biggest city, the fifth biggest city, all roughly have a third, a fourth, a fifth the population of Mexico City. So generally most developed countries follow rank-sized rules. So this is a common question that they ask on the AP test a lot, is they'll say something to the effect of, in a country that has 1 million people, in their largest city, how many people would we expect to see in their second largest city if they follow rank-sized rule? And that would just be 1/2 of 1 million, so 500,000 people. So that's a common question that they tend to ask. So if you look at this for the United States, and you kind of compare the U.S. and Mexico, obviously I said Mexico's got a primate city in Mexico City, which has over 20 million people living there. So their second biggest city only has 5 million. So you can see that they don't really follow rank-sized rule there at the beginning, but then it starts to there on out. Okay, the United States, okay, largest city being New York City, okay, fifth largest city being Houston, roughly follows this idea of rank-sized rule. Now, again, it's not going to be exact, but it's going to be kind of a rough estimate of what the size of those cities looks like. Now, where this becomes more prevalent is not just necessarily the size of the city, but the size of the metropolitan area. And this is why this graph is a little screwy, is if you look at this, it's like, oh, the fifth largest city has about 6 million people in it. New York's only got 18 million. That doesn't seem to follow. Well, if you look at the New York metropolitan area, which if you go back to that map that I showed you yesterday, and you kind of look at the New York City metropolitan area, this is pretty much all of this area in orange down here, which encompasses New York, New Jersey, parts of Connecticut. So it's a very large area. So if you look at the metro area as a whole, then the United States really very clearly follows this idea of rank-sized rule. But again, if you look at just simply the population, it doesn't really appear to. But the main thing you need to know here for the purposes of the AP test is if you hear the idea of rank-sized rule, just know that it means that the third largest city in a country has 1/3 the population of the largest city, and so on, and that kind of tiers down. And we see that in most developed countries. Now, developing countries, they're going to tend to follow the idea of primate cities, where they have that one really big, super large city that exists there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is the idea of market area analysis and how businesses tend to figure out where they want to locate. So let's say I want to open a business. So let's say I decide I'm going to open a coffee shop. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate these pieces of information. So I want to calculate the range. So the first thing I'm going to look at is how far do I think somebody's going to travel to visit a coffee shop. So if you think they're okay, if I wanted to locate this coffee shop at Inglewood, obviously there's a Starbucks at Inglewood, there's a Tim Hortons, there's another local coffee shop in Inglewood. So we've got some options, Boston Stoker, things like that. So we've got a bunch of coffee shops in the area. So that's going to obviously limit the range that somebody might be willing to travel to my coffee shop. Chances are somebody's not going to drive from Centerville to Inglewood to get a cup of coffee. So the range, how far somebody's willing to travel, is going to be fairly small when I'm conducting that analysis. So the range is going to be small. I then have to compute my threshold. And this is one of the reasons that small businesses tend to struggle, particularly in the food industry, is that they have to kind of meet the expenses. I mean, you can't buy things in bulk like a lot of big companies, chain restaurants can. That impacts the threshold. So if I decide how many patrons I'm going to need to meet my expenses, I may need to get 1,000 people through my door every single day in order to be able to pay my bills. Now, if I'm only having a range of maybe 5 minutes, I have to draw a lot of people in every single day in order to meet that. Now, if you look at the Starbucks there on Main Street, there in front of Meijer, they're going to get 1,000 people through there every day. So that's not that big of a deal for them because they're a name, they're right by the highway, they have all of these things going for them that a small coffee shop that maybe doesn't locate right by the highway may not have. So the threshold that you need to be able to survive, you have to kind of calculate that. And then you have to draw the market area. So I want to draw essentially what is my hinterland? Where do I think I might be able to draw people from? So if I would decide I'm going to locate my store in, let's say, the old Kmart Plaza there, okay, I'm going to maybe draw people from those neighborhoods that are right around there that maybe don't want to drive all the way down by Meijer to get a cup of coffee. So I might be able to draw people from there. I might be able to draw people from over by Kroger. I might draw people from around the high school. Chances are I'm not going to draw people from south of 70 because they have Boston Stoker, they have Starbucks, they have all of these different options down there to get a cup of coffee. They're going to drive by Tim Hortons on the way to my store. So chances are the market area that I'm going to have is going to be fairly small in terms of that. So in addition to the range, if I'm looking at how far someone might be willing to travel to get a cup of coffee, I'm only looking at 5-10 minutes tops. And then if I have all of these other competitors within that area, that's going to really limit potentially the amount of stuff that I'm able to sell. So you always want to try to do this when you're starting some new sort of business. Now, let me give you an example. And I always hear people when I did this last year, everybody said, well, the thing we need in Inglewood is a Chick-fil-A. And everybody would love to have a Chick-fil-A in Inglewood. Well, let's look at why we don't have one here. Okay. If you look at the Chick-fil-A on Miller Lane, okay, and if you ever go over there, they are always packed. Okay, drive-through wrapped around the building. The one in Beaver Creek, when I worked out at Wright State for years, drive-through wrapped around the building constantly. Now, if you're Chick-fil-A and they know that somebody who lives in Inglewood is willing to drive to Miller Lane to get Chick-fil-A, why do they need to open another store? Okay, yes, they might be able to make more money, but if what they're doing is cutting into the market for that particular store by basically chopping off the western half of that market, maybe it doesn't make financial sense for them to do that. So there's a reason why some of these businesses that we would love to see pop up at Inglewood don't show up here. If you look at these sit-down restaurants that you see in Beaver Creek, that you see in Centerville, right now they're starting to pop up in Huber Heights. And Huber Heights really demographically is very similar to the Northmont area. The thing that Huber Heights has is that they have the Rose, they have some of these music venues. They've had for a while a few more chain stores like Dick's Sporting Goods and places like that are kind of anchors for that area that tend to draw those restaurants and other things around it, kind of like that idea of clustering or agglomeration we talked about before. So the idea of market area analysis is you want to be able to have an area be a draw. And if you look at I know they talked about maybe putting a restaurant in the old Ponderosa before they tore that down, trying to get something to come into the Kmart Plaza, things like that. Well, when you have a bunch of empty stores, there's really not anything that really draws people into that area. And that brings us to this last idea, which is essentially known as the gravity model. And the gravity model basically helps predict the optimal location of a business based upon the number of people in the area and inversely related to the distance people must travel to access it. So what does Huber Heights have that the Northmont area doesn't have? And the answer is everything to its west. If you look to the west of the Northmont area, you have rural. Okay, everything out in Preble County is rural. If you go north up 49, it's rural. There's not a lot of people there. And that's really going to impact the ability of us to really draw anything. If you look at Huber Heights, what's to the west of them? Well, us. You also have, if you go north of them, you go up into Tip City, which is a larger market. If you go south of Huber Heights, you go down into Dayton, which is a larger market. So the thing that they have, and it's the idea of this gravity model, is the thing that's in the middle that kind of everything kind of goes around and pulls, kind of creates that pull for an area. It's something that Huber Heights has right now that the Northmont area doesn't, which is why we don't see some of these things pop up in our area. So the gravity model basically says that the optimal location is directly related to the number of people. So if you remember back to your math classes, direct relationship means that the more desirable something is, equals more people. So they're going in the same direction. And it's inversely related to the distance people have to travel to access it, meaning the more desirable it is, the fewer minutes you need to go to get there. So those two things work in the opposite direction. So essentially, the best location for anything is one that's going to minimize travel for all potential customers for whatever that business happens to be. And there's some really good maps in here, and I think that if you look through this chapter, what you'll see is that the guy who actually wrote our textbook is a professor at Miami University. So he has a lot of knowledge of this area. And if you look at where certain stores are located in our area, you'll see this. So if you look at Macy's or certain department stores, where do we see our Macy's locations? Well, you see them in Centerville and you see them out in Beaver Creek. And if you look at the median household income in these areas, these darker tan areas, you're going to see that they're basically located with a couple things in mind. Now, obviously, the one in Beaver Creek is located basically in the center of a really fairly wealthy area. It's going to draw people from all around it. It may also draw people in from Dayton. The one down in Centerville seems like it's located in a weird place because it's right at the edge of a poorer area where it's also kind of on the edge of a wealthier area. But the key here is the access to the highway. Is that right? The fact that it's right there on 75, and obviously the income on this map has changed a little bit since this book was written, because the Austin Landing area, which is very, very wealthy down south of Centerville, is also very high income, and that's going to be a draw for those places. But if you put a Macy's in Inglewood, it's not going to survive, because if you look at the area surrounding Inglewood, there's not enough people to the west, the northwest, to be able to draw to that location that are going to make that place profitable. Now, Kroger, grocery stores, you're going to see grocery stores everywhere. And whether you're high income, low income, whatever the case may be, people still have to eat. Now, one of the interesting things about this map, and you can kind of, maybe if you've been paying attention to the news, I think I mentioned this earlier this year, is that there have been 2 Kroger locations that have closed within the last couple years, and this has been a fairly big deal when this happened. And if you look at this map here, you can kind of maybe guess where those 2 Kroger locations are, and they're the 2 that are right there north of Dayton. The one there right on Needmore Road is still open, and it's still open right now, but that's the one there right along 49 is closed as you kind of go up to the left there. The one on Needmore Road is still open, but they're not making investments there. If you look at where our the new fancier Krogers like we have in Inglewood are, you're not going to see that type of investment in lower income areas. So what you tend to see when you look at certain locations here is that income of an area and the draw of that area tends to impact where these places are gonna locate. Now, if you look out in the West Dayton area, we talked earlier this year about food deserts and the fact that you don't see certain things in certain places. There's no grocery stores out there. Okay. And then finally, Walmarts. Okay, Walmart's obviously not as high end as what you would see with the Macy's. They're going to draw in people from lower income areas, but they tend to locate themselves in areas that are a little bit higher income. And the reason they do that is oftentimes for safety and security. Oftentimes stores believe that the higher income neighborhood that they're in, the wealthier, or I'm sorry, the less issues they're going to have with crime. So if you look at the income of Trotwood versus the income of Clayton, the Walmart store used to be there on Salem Avenue in Trotwood, and they moved and built a new store, the new one here on Hoke Road in Inglewood, that was kind of shifting maybe only 3 or 4 miles away, but it shifted into an area that was higher income. And there was a reason for that. It brought it into the middle of a market, kind of the idea of the gravity model for our area, but it also looked at an area that's a little bit higher income to be able to minimize crime or things like that you would see at those stores. If you look at where the other Walmarts are, you kind of get similar things in each one of those locations. Now, again, big idea for today, rank size rule, primate cities. Okay, those are 2 things you need to pay attention to. And then this idea of the gravity model, the things that influence where a store happens to locate. Now, your writing prompt for today is I want you to look at a specific type of business. So I want you to, for today, look at some sort of sit-down chain restaurant. So let's say something like an Olive Garden or a Red Robin or something like that. Tell me why those types of stores would or would not locate in the Inglewood area, and use the terms that we talked about today to answer that question. So that you can use some central place theory concepts from yesterday, as well as some of the ideas we talked about today. So why would a chain sit-down restaurant, a Red Robin, Cracker Barrel, Olive Garden, something like that, why would or would not they locate in the Inglewood area? Kind of use the terms in this chapter to describe that. That's it for today. I will talk to everybody tomorrow. Have a great day.